Yesterday I had the privilege of meeting a man, and we talked for a while just about life and his upbringing, as his upbringing was similar to mine, but definitely different since he was between 80 and 85 years old. But one thing we spent a lot of time talking about is our Christian lives, our Christian walks, our walks with God, and how we can serve Him. And throughout this conversation, he shared with me one of his evangelism strategies, one of the ways in which he shares his faith, shares the gospel message. And he told me that whenever he shares his faith, what he always does is he always just tells people what God has done for him. It is his testimony, it is his experience. And this is very good because the reason a lot of us don't share our faith is some of us, sure, it's fear. We're afraid of rejection. We're afraid of not knowing what to say in response to someone else. We're afraid we don't know enough about the Bible. And the second reason we don't really share our faith is we don't think that we know enough about God's Word. We don't think we're smart enough. We don't think we're knowledgeable enough. But the Bible never says anywhere that you have to be a biblical scholar to effectively share your faith. And that is what this man has reminded me of yesterday. That you don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes the best way to share your faith is to tell someone else your experience with God. Because some things, they can argue against, but it's hard to argue against something that someone has experienced. What someone has felt. Something that people have experienced. They've experienced the power of God in their life. And if we too are Christians, then we too have an experience. We have a story to tell. We have a testimony. And we need to be sharing that testimony. And this is a very biblical thing to do. We see that Paul did this in Acts chapter 22 and chapter 26. He shares his story. And Paul had a fantastic story. Paul was a persecutor of the church, as many of you are aware of, where before his conversion, Paul hunted down Christians and threw them into prison and oftentimes would have them killed for their faith in Jesus. But one day on the road to Damascus, Paul was confronted by Jesus himself. And Jesus spoke to Saul and he said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And long story short, this eventually led to Paul's conversion, to where Paul becomes a Christian. And on a minimum of 2 separate occasions, Paul shares this, his story, his testimony, as a way to lead people to Christ. Because the reason why sharing your story is so powerful is because you can talk about what God has delivered you from, how God has changed you, how God has given you these new desires, and how God has given you victory over things in your past life, how God has given you a hope, how God has given you peace, and so on. That's powerful because we live in a world where people want peace. We live in a world where people want victory. And in your personal story, in your testimony, you too have hope. You too have victory. You too have peace. So this week, today, tomorrow, next week, I want to challenge you to find someone in your life, whether it's someone at work, someone at a restaurant, someone at school, someone at the gas station, wherever you are. I want you to be praying that God will place someone in your path that you can share your story with hopes that they too may want to have a story like yours. And as you're sharing your story, make sure you put all the emphasis on none of this would have been possible had it not been for my faith in Jesus and how Jesus has changed me. He saved me, and He can do the same exact thing for you. So throughout this next week, I challenge you to find someone to share your story with. Because your story is powerful.